It's Thursday, the 10th of November. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Tobias Ellwood, Shadow Treasury Minister James Murray, the economics editor of The Spectator, Kate Andrews, and the General Secretary of the University and College Union, Joe Grady. Today,
I'm watching every single penny. Even buying kind of fairly basic stuff like clothes and replacing shoes.
Nurses across the UK vote to strike for the first time ever, with many of them saying they can't make ends meet. But will they get the pay rise that they're asking for?
A demand of 17%, 3 times what most non-public sector workers will receive, is out of step with the economic circumstances that we face.
The government's facing a winter of strikes, and bosses everywhere are desperate for more workers. Is more immigration the answer? Brexiteer and Tory peer Lord Wolfson thinks so.
We have got people queuing up to come to this country to pick crops that are rotting in fields, to work in warehouses that otherwise wouldn't be operable, and we're not letting them in.
And this week, Sir Keir Starmer's had another pop at how private schools are funded.
Scrap the non-dom tax breaks and end the farce of taxpayers subsidising private schools. That's what Labour would do.
Is cutting their tax breaks a fair way of raising more cash for the country? But before we delve into all of that, questions continue about whether politicians should be taking time away from their day job to go and enjoy themselves in a hot, faraway country. No, not Matt Hancock's exploits in the jungle, which we might mention a bit later on, but the much more serious issue of whether politicians should be going to watch the World Cup in Qatar. Wales announced its squad yesterday, and Gareth Southgate will be unveiling his squad later this afternoon. Wales's First Minister Mark Drakeford will attend, but Labour's Chris Bryant had this to say.
Look, I'd say to Mark and to Vaughan, you may think you're going to be able to convince them to change their minds on human rights. You won't. They have a very settled view. They think that homosexuality is a perversion. I know Mark and Vaughan's commitment to LGBT rights is absolute, so I absolutely hope that they won't go.
Tobias Ellwood, the Gulf state has been widely criticised, of course, for its ban on same-sex relationships. Do you think any politician should be going to Qatar?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's naive to assume FIFA to give Qatar the World Cup and try to keep politics out of it. It's naive to assume that Qatar can somehow think that they're not going to be scrutinised for what's actually going on in their country. The fact that the World Cup is going there will actually shine a light on the country and nudge them forward. This is a country I know very well. I was foreign minister. I visited the country about a dozen times over the last decade. They are slowly making progress. Do they need to move faster? Absolutely they do. But the World Cup will actually help with this. And it's a deeply Salafist religion that's observed there. You have the same in Saudi Arabia. When these countries move too quickly, then there is a conservative element. We saw that with those comments on the German television with a former Qatari football player, completely out of sync with what the younger generation in Qatar wants. I make this point, though, that we had the honour to host the World Cup in 1966. What was the rules on homosexuality then? It was illegal. It was illegal. Alan Turing, for example, what happened to him when it was discovered that he was a homosexual? He was offered either prison or chemical castration. And one of our heroes of our nation then took his life. And this country is advancing. Yes, we want it to move faster. It gained its independence in 1971. From which country? From the United Kingdom. So we need to work with the Qataris. We need to work with others in the Middle East as well to advance this forward. I think the World Cup will go very, very well indeed. I think everybody will be able to enjoy themselves. We shouldn't let this opportunity to allow the limelight, the focus, the international attention to go unmissed in advancing this country.
Joe, what do you think about Tobias's argument?
I suspect Alan Turing is spinning in his grave. What a disgraceful use of his memory. Before I actually answer the question...
You're defending Britain's behaviour
Before I answer the question, no, to suggest that we should be championing a World Cup in Qatar. Before I answer the question, I think it's really important to send love and solidarity to the 6,000 families and friends of workers that have died building and maintaining the World Cup that's going to happen in Qatar. I think it's disgraceful.
But on the question, should politicians be going?
No, I don't think they should. I'm really clear on this. I think hosting the World Cup in Qatar, the idea that football is a beautiful game, it loses its status. What message are we sending to gay supporters, gay players? And, you know, it's no surprise to me, to be honest, Tobias, that you're backing the World Cup in Qatar, because during the pandemic, your party were just as happy to back dodgy PPE contracts. So I don't expect any scruples.
I wasn't in government at that time, and there's something called the kafala system, if I can just touch on that,
briefly,
which you're absolutely right to say was wrong for the Qataris to observe. This inability for foreign workers to be able to have control over their own contracts. It was the British government, it was the British embassy, me as a foreign minister, that got this changed. But it's also FIFA that needs to recognise, if it gives the World Cup contract to a country, it's naive to assume that somehow that it should dodge over the actual
does it legitimise
the
the policies in Qatar now by politicians visiting while complaining very forcefully about the policies, the social policies that they have in place right now? I mean,
no, every opportunity must be made, as I will do as well. I'll be in the region, I'll be in Bahrain. Who will I be visiting? I'll be actually visiting human rights activists. I'll be understanding better where they are going. They are on a journey. We're taking a snapshot here, and it's understood. Sorry, let me finish this point. We're taking a snapshot of where Qatar is today. Look where they were 10 years ago. Look where we were 30 years ago. Look where they could be in 10 years' time. I think the World Cup, agreed, absolutely right. I want everybody to feel safe there. They've got a long way to go. But the idea that we shout from afar or deny the World Cup from going there, I think is a missed opportunity.
Mark Drakeford, the most powerful, senior elected Labour politician in the country, is going. Do you think he's made the right call?
Well, he's making a decision in the context of his position in Wales. Wales qualifying for the first time in 60 years. You know, I know that Mark's commitment to LGBT rights and to workers' rights is incredibly strong, and I'm sure he'll be using his position there to make that point. Now, we've taken a different decision in Westminster. We've decided that the Labour front bench won't be attending to make our point as well. And I think what's really important is that we do use this opportunity to push Qatar on workers' rights, on LGBT rights. And if I can just say, you know, when I heard James Cleverly as the Foreign Secretary talking about LGBT fans going there and telling them to, keep it to themselves or sort of hide their sexuality. As a gay man myself, I was pretty disgusted by hearing that, to be honest. I thought, you know, it is not for the Foreign Secretary of our country to say, oh, just hide it, you know, keep it hidden, keep quiet and so on. I think it's for the Foreign Secretary to make sure that British citizens travelling overseas feel safe when they're doing so.
But we're talking about a senior Labour politician, Mark Drakeford, who will be going. You've said the Labour front bench here have made a stand not to go. Presumably, therefore, you think Mark Drakeford has made the wrong call.
Well, he's making a call in the context of his position in Wales. What I'm telling you is our position in terms of the Westminster Parliament. Well, we're representing our constituents in Parliament. We want to be, obviously, the next government. We're making our decision that we're not going to attend, in terms of front bench, Labour politicians in the Westminster Parliament going to Qatar.
Kate, what do you think? FIFA obviously doesn't like this discussion about whether politicians should be going or not, and has said football should not be...
Shouldn't have granted the World Cup to Qatar, though.
FIFA has said football shouldn't be dragged into political battles or hand out moral lessons.
It was a huge mistake on the part of FIFA and a questionable one, too, to give the World Cup to Qatar. It is now the situation we're in. And I'm hesitant to point fingers at individuals because, let's be honest, if you watch the World Cup, I'm really looking forward to it. If you buy a T-shirt, if you use the hashtag, you are playing a role in this charade. Going is playing a role in this charade that we are giving Qatar this incredible opportunity to show itself off. Yes, there is going to be some questions over its human rights regime, but let's be honest, most people going there, including politicians, are not going to criticize the human rights regime. They're going to watch the football and have a good time. So I think we should all kind of acknowledge that playing into this is playing into the charade. And I would just encourage politicians to ask themselves, you know, in terms of representing your constituents, your country, what what matters more, going to watch the football or opposing so much of what Qatar stands for in terms of its opposition to gay rights and human rights? And it's a choice for individuals.
It's a question that politicians are going to be asked, I think, a lot in the coming days as we get closer to the World Cup. But we need to move on.
You can defend it would be my point.
We need to move on to nurses striking. For the first time in over 100 years, they have voted to take strike action, and it features on many of the front pages this morning that we can see here. The walkout will involve Royal College of Nursing members in many of the country's biggest hospitals. Nurses in every service in Scotland and Northern Ireland voted for action. In Wales, all but one health board did, while in England, the turnout was too low in nearly half of NHS trusts for strike action to take place. But it's clearly the latest sign a winter of industrial arrest is brewing as the government faces pressure from across the public sector to increase pay. Well, we can speak now to Harry Eccles, who's a clinical nurse specialist, works in the Isle of Wight, but is joining us from Southampton today. Hello, Harry. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, how are you doing?
Yeah, you voted for strike action. Why?
For me, the important issue came down to patient safety and trying to deliver the effective care that we want to deliver as nurses. I've been qualified for about 4 years now myself and working in my speciality. And things just get harder and harder, and I see more colleagues leaving the profession and less people joining the profession. And as we've got those nursing vacancies, it falls down to the nurses who remain to pick up that extra slack. And it gets to a point where you're carrying that extra percent day in, day out, day in, and it really takes its emotional toll, really. And it's a really horrible position to be in when you're leaving work for the day. Instead of reflecting on all the things that you're proud of, you're reflecting on all the things that you weren't able to do, all the times you weren't able to seize an opportunity to make a difference. And I can only see it getting worse if we don't fix this issue with safe staffing.
Now, it's a huge pay rise that you're asking for, 5% above RPI inflation, which is about 17, that would take it to 17.5%, far more than many of your patients in the public and private sectors are getting at the moment. Why should you get an increase of that sort of scale?
But I think it's important to look at that in the broader context and look at the amount of time we've had a below inflation pay rises. So we've had real term pay cuts. I mean, the same number we can quote today meant a very different thing 20 years ago, because as we know, inflation changes and the price of things change. What we're asking for is a genuine real pay rise to reflect, first of all, the need to recruit more nurses. What we do know is that we have less and less nurses in the profession. We have less joining and more leaving. The only way to change that is to make it more attractive. And actually, in terms of what we do know is by looking back, as we've had real term pay cuts, we have had lower and lower nursing numbers, and that's something we do know.
The NHS clearly is under pressure on a huge number of fronts at the moment. I wonder what this walkout will do to the care that people can expect to receive in hospitals. And are you worried about that?
Well, I mean, of course I'm worried, but I've been worried for the past few years. Every time I turn up to work, I've got that feeling of dread in my stomach, thinking about the things we're going to have to try and deal with, knowing that we're trying to deal with it without the amount of colleagues we should have. And that's a really horrible place to be in. We've been worried for so long, and that's why it's got to a point, you know, for nurses to stand up, and you've got to look, like you said in your introduction, this is unprecedented. The first time the RCN in its 106-year history has voted across all the nations to have this strike. And the reason is this has gone on for so long, and we're already worried about patient safety. We're already worried about patient care. Just to give some context, in my role, I've seen referrals go up 100%, but I haven't doubled. You know, we're 46,000 nurses short, yet we're not having a reduction in that same percentage of patients. So it gets harder and harder and harder. And I think from what I've been hearing from people in the public who are worried about the strike is that they're worried because their experiences have already been difficult. They're already having difficult experiences because of that shortage that's already there.
Harry, stay with us. Let me ask Tobias. People working in hospitals and in many other parts of the public sector on low wages really struggling right now with the real terms cuts to their pay that they're seeing. I mean, how are people like Harry meant to cope without getting the sort of increases that they're looking for?
Well, I hear similar stories at Bournemouth Hospital as well that Harry is articulating. It isn't just about the pay itself. It's about the workforce. It's about the absentee ability to be able to fill those gaps. It links back to migration, about Brexit as well, I'm afraid, too, as to where we are with our important NHS that did such a fantastic job during COVID. But what we're about to embark on is a budget, a review of our finances. There is this, I think, appetite to support the NHS, arguably beyond other services, because of their role, their history, what they do for the country. I would just humbly ask, wait to see what Jeremy Hunt is going to do, because I suspect you will see some ring fencing to provide support. But
do you think that they should get a 17% pay rise?
Well, you heard Steve Barclay say there that would be...
The government says it's unaffordable.
It is.
What do you think?
Well, firstly, interest rates have just gone up, so that'll have an inflationary impact on that. Other measures will be taken into place to try and get the finances under control. And yes, I'll say it before it's mentioned, we've had a miserable summer on that front as well. But we're back on showing greater economic stability. What we need to recognise, though, is that by having not just these strikes, but other strikes in transport and so forth, that will actually damage the economy. The very thing that's concerning here, that we're unable to find that. And guess who picks up the pieces? If I can just make this final point. Who picks up the pieces when these strikes go on, particularly if they're reoccurring? It is the armed forces. I just say this as chair of the Defence Select Committee, and they already overstretched themselves. So please, can we wait to see what happens next week and then take stock, get back to the negotiating table, see what can be done there?
Talks continue, James. What do you think about 17% as a request? And do you think if Labour was in power that they would match that? Would they find the money?
Well, look, I'll tell you what the difference would be if we were in power. We would be there negotiating with the RCN around the table with the representatives of nurses, trying to come to a deal, because no one wants strikes to go ahead. Nurses don't want to go on strike. Patients don't want to go on strike. We don't want this strike to go ahead. And I think it's actually, a real sign of negligence from the government that they have failed to engage with the RCN over summer. And actually, I don't think there's been a meeting between the Health Secretary and the RCN since Sajid Javid was Health Secretary.
Would you have an idea about where a compromise figure could be found? Do you think the 17%, first of all, is an affordable demand for the NHS?
Well, look, coming to a deal is what you do by sitting down around the table and trying to find that deal. You don't come to it live on a TV show like this. You do that by getting in there and responding to the RCN's request for meetings, having those discussions and trying to avert the strike that no one wants. And, we heard from Harry there all of the stress that he's been through. One of the first meetings I had as an MP when I was elected in 2019 was with the RCN before COVID. Throughout COVID, I kept meeting them virtually on Zoom, obviously, to see how they were doing. And they were working so hard. They were so exhausted, but so dedicated. And we need a proper plan for the workforce now.
Joe, Tobias makes the point that this will be incredibly disruptive, and it's the army that will probably be called upon to try and keep services running. Is that fair?
I'll come to that, but one thing that needs addressing from the conversation that's just come out, nurses have been offered 4.7%, they're asking for 17%. There is a huge gulf between there, but it sounds like the country has seen more health secretaries and the RCN have had negotiation meetings. So before I even come to the idea of...
The 17% then is a negotiating tactic. It's not what they're really asking for.
Who knows what they would settle for? The point is they're not being negotiated with. So if there is a question about fairness, about who carries the can, well, if the armed services are stretched, that's a question for the government as well. We have just heard testimony from Harry that suggests that nurses are going on to shift day in, day out, worried about the patient's safety because there are insufficient people. Our NHS is crumbling. Nurses are collapsing from exhaustion in food banks. Nurses are leaving the sector in droves. This is a source of national shame. And I will not stand for nurses now being put in the firing line for doing what is right for them and ultimately what is right for their patients' care. So whether 17% is what the dispute ends up being settled on is not the point. The government is in disarray. We've seen chaos, and nurses have held the NHS together, not just for years, but throughout all that period. So, I'm not going to sit here and let them be talked about as if they're just playing games.
Briefly, Tobias.
Well, the conversation is, the wider issues, absolutely, they need to be addressed. Today, right now, here in this discussion, it's about whether it's 17% or what's on the table, which is 5%.
It's also about the fact they're not being negotiated with. It is difficult to call a ballot. They've got to breaking point.
May I finish my sentence? It's whether or not, and you touched on it yourself, whether there's a negotiation to be had between those figures. What I'm saying is that you've got Jeremy Hunt very conscious of the national picture, of the support, the love that we have for the NHS. And I suspect that we will see something ring-fenced there. But I touch on, and I underline the wider issues, we need to look at the workforce. Why aren't we able to recruit and fill the vacancies? Because
we're going to come on to workforce questions in a minute when we talk about immigration. Sure.
To be able to keep working.
The last time Jeremy Hunt was Health Secretary, we had a junior doctor strike and that ended disastrously. I placed no
Kate, can I ask you, do you think that we're looking at a war of attrition now between the government and nurses? And politically, how do you see that playing out?
Well, politically speaking, it's a really tough one because I think oftentimes people are on the side of the healthcare workers, especially nurses. I think there's a broad consensus that their pay is too low. But this morning we learned that over 40,000 people waited more than 12 hours last month to get into A&E. There are a record number 7 million people on the NHS England waiting list. That's expected to go up to at least 9 million by 2024. It could go even higher. I'm not sure how long that sympathy lasts when people are genuinely terrified about their access to healthcare in this country at the moment. Nurses do deserve a pay raise. 17% is too high. We are at a crossroads of healthcare in this country. The government currently spends, I think in about 2 years, is set to spend 44% of day-to-day government spending on healthcare. Now, if you think that's too low, if you think that we need to be pouring more and more money into the NHS, and part of that is salaries, what number would you like that to be? And what would you like the state not to do in order to essentially turn to being an NHS with a government attached? It is not normal in other developed countries for the army to be coming in to support the winter months, right? All countries have had a healthcare crisis during COVID, there's no question about it. But the NHS was on its knees long before that.
Do you think we are avoiding, as Kate suggests, a proper debate about how the NHS is funded and structured long term? And that this is sort of symbolic of that?
Well, look, I think there's a question here about workforce. I know you said we're going to get onto that in a second, but there is a really important point here. But there is a really important point about the workforce here and about, what choices a government makes. And there's a choice that we set out we would make in government, which is to scrap the non-dom tax loophole and use that money to pay for extra workforce in the NHS.
The size of the NHS budget we're talking about, vastly.
No, well, cutting that loophole would raise just over £3 billion, and some of that money would go towards expanding the NHS workforce. Now, we know that there has been a gap in the NHS workforce.
44% of day-to-day government spending. It's only going to go up.
We heard from Harry there, how he and his colleagues are overstretched and there aren't the people to do the work. We know there is a problem with recruitment. We know that we need to improve the NHS workforce. We've set out a fully costed plan to do that, and that would make a real difference in the way the NHS works in this country.
This answer right here, with all due respect, is the fundamental problem. No party is willing to engage with the very real issue that with aging demographics and the way everything is changing, we can afford it by doing less in other areas, or something has to give. And your colleague Wes Streeting's been excellent on this. He is willing to talk about money and reform going hand in hand together.
And Wes is absolutely right to say that.
But you cannot pretend that £3 billion is the solution to the NHS crisis.
We do need more workforce. Wes is being really clear that we need more workforce and we need that reform of the NHS. But you can't say we just need reform and we don't need the extra workforce, because the truth is
no one's arguing against the workforce. The genuine question is how you plan to
Can I just quickly ask Harry, before we move on to strikes that are happening across the public sector? Harry, responding to what Tobias was saying, that this is going to put sort of unfair pressure on other parts of the public sector, including the army, to try and deal with the effects of the strike that you're hoping to have.
Well, I say that lies.
Oh, I think we've lost Harry. Let's move. Harry, we'll come back to you if your line returns. Harry, did you hear the question?
I did hear the question. Sorry, was that in response to Tobias there? Yeah. So what I would say in response to that is that actually this does lie with the government. This doesn't lie with nurses. The RCN are there, been trying to negotiate. This has been building for years and years and years. This isn't something that's just happened. This is the last resort. And we've put our proposal to the government and we're getting nothing back. So I think in terms of that, waiting to negotiate, we're there waiting. And of course, it's going to be difficult. It's going to be a difficult time for everybody. But it has been a difficult time. We're saying this one more week. That's hard to say. And with regards to people already worrying and clinics being short, yes, but every nurse that goes off sick, that's another clinic cancelled, and it can't go on. So this does lie with the government. This is a political decision, and it's for them to be the ones to resolve this.
Thanks, Harry. I mean, this is, of course, the latest example of industrial action. People are either balloting or planning strikes right now in the public sector, and it's a big dividing line, isn't it, now, in politics, James? Yesterday in the Commons, Rishi Sunak said that the government was strengthening the economy while Labour was backing strikers. And the government is talking, at least, if not necessarily legislating yet, to keep sort of essential services going during strikes, perhaps increasing the ballot threshold. This is a big dividing line. Are you on the right side of it, do you think, when it comes to public opinion?
Look, we see this pattern across all different sectors where the government sees industrial disputes coming down the line and they run in the other direction. You know, they don't get around the negotiating table, they don't try and find a solution, they let the strikes play out, and more often than not, they blame the workers themselves. You know, what we have said every time there is the prospect of industrial action is that we would do everything we can to try and get a solution, to try and get a deal, to try and avoid strikes going ahead. And we've said that in terms of what's happened with the nurses, but we've also said that in terms of other issues which have been coming up as well. And I think that's the real dividing line here. Do you have a government, which we would be in government, who will roll up their sleeves and try and get a deal to avoid the strikes that no one wants to see go ahead? Or do you have a government who stands back, takes their hands off, lets the strikes go ahead and actually blames the workers for what's happening?
Briefly, Tobias, I'm not sure what the government's plans are now when it comes to changing strike laws. Do you?
Or anything.
I would hate to see us go down that route where that's where we would end up going. But you could see the general public saying this is actually damaging our economy, not just one isolated strike, but a series of strikes with, rail transport, so forth, and indeed nursing as well.
So
this isn't what. If I can I'll finish this point. The first step is to recognise where this is going in the long term. This will damage our economy, the very thing that's paying all these salaries, and secondly, it will make us less attractive to get businesses here, get tourism here, to actually support as well. If I can just make the point, can I just make the point which perhaps needs to be included in this discussion
briefly,
can I just make the point, is the fact that there is an international element to this of where inflation is actually going. And that's what we need to hear from Jeremy Hunt. What is being done to reduce the gap between earnings and indeed inflation, with the rise of the cost of prices and earnings as well. And that we need to hear what
in 10 seconds. Hang on, in 10 seconds.
I'd like to be blunt about the strike question. When it comes to healthcare, the government, I think, has every right to bring in as much temporary work as it can find, because if nurses go on strike, people's lives are at risk.
OK, we need to move on. And we've touched on what we're about to talk about a little bit already, which is the labour market. And the UK economy is clearly in a very tight spot at the moment. And there's a big question about whether more immigration might help. Now, there's been an interesting intervention from Lord Wolfson, who's the chief executive of Next. He's a Tory peer, donor. He supported Brexit. And he's been talking to the BBC's business editor, Simon Jack.
We have got people queuing up to come to this country to pick crops that are rotting in fields, to work in warehouses that otherwise wouldn't be operable, and we're not letting them in. And we have to take a different approach to economically productive migration. We have to control immigration, but we have to control it in such a way that benefits our economy rather than cripples it.
Lord Wolfson. Well, we're joined now by Richard Tice, who's the leader of Reform UK. Hello, Richard. What did you think about what Lord Wolfson had to say? More unskilled immigration, essential for the economy.
Good afternoon. Well, Lord Wolfson's comments are just out of kilter with the reality, which is that we've got a record high population in this country. Last year, we had a record number of visas issued, 1.1 million people to come into the country and work. And the truth is, tragically, we've also got 1 in 8 of the working age population in the UK, some 5.3 million people on full-time out-of-work benefits. That's 1.5 million more than pre-COVID. The truth is, there's a labour shortage everywhere around the world. I've just come back from Australia. They've got the same issue, post-COVID dislocation. The focus needs to be on getting our own great talent, people who are trapped in out-of-work benefits, help them, support them, train them, get them back into the workplace. That will save billions of pounds for the Treasury. But most importantly, it'll use that incredible talent. What I worry about Lord Wolfson's comments, it's very easy for big businesses like the one he runs to rely on cheap, low-skilled labour and bringing it in from overseas and not training our own people. That is the crucial thing. And it's the same everywhere, including on nurses. We've got to train many, many more nurses. You've got to make work pay by lifting the tax threshold on income tax from 12.5 grand to £20,000 a year, which is the Reform UK's policy. That will make work pay.
Let me bring in Tobias.
It'll lift millions of people out of work benefits.
Thanks. Tobias, what do you think about what Lord Wolfson had to say? This is a touchy subject within the Tory party at the moment.
It is, but I'm willing to step forward. The whole issue of Brexit, I mean, people dare not even mention its name. I'm conscious of that Richard is there. I agree, firstly, with Richard, that, and I think we would all agree, to better educate our indigenous capability absolutely makes sense. We need to better understand what's required by industry, business and so forth, academia, and match that with what we're actually teaching as well. take the space industry, 7,000 graduate vacancies, and we can't fill them. So that's slowing us down in our position as a capability from space. When you're talking about these issues to do with migration, Brexit, the decision we took had a knock-on impact. COVID compounded that, of us losing about 10% of overseas support.
So what do we do now?
Well, this is the thing. You need to then embrace that and recognise that. I stepped forward and said, this model of Brexit is not working to our benefit. It's costing us 4% of our GDP.
Hang on, Richard's trying to come back.
Let me finish the point. What I'm saying is, and as soon as I say this, I get then labelled as, a Remainer. I'm not. Nobody, only you people uses Brexiteer Remainer language in the Westminster bubble. But the British people actually have moved on from the referendum themselves. But they do want a model of Brexit that works. And that includes making sure that we can get the best support, if required, from overseas, as well as train our own capabilities.
Richard, do you think it would be a betrayal of Brexit voters to increase unskilled immigration right now?
No, the point is, we need a points-based system, which we've got. There are over 230 types of jobs that you can bring people into the UK, sponsor them, 800 job titles, down to a salary of just over £16,000, which is only just over half our average salary. And Tobias is wrong on the fact there are over 500,000 more people, non-EU people, of working age population here in the UK. There's only about 50,000 less EU citizens. The reality is we've got to focus on our own people who are trapped on out-of-work benefits and get those people incentivised and helped and trained back into work urgently. We don't need to bring in cheap, low-skilled people from overseas. We need to help our own people. That's right for them, their families, their children and their communities.
Joe, what did you think of what Lord Wolfson said?
So I think the starting point really has to be that, migration has always been central to the economic prosperity of the UK. It has. What I don't like about this debate is treating migrants as second-class citizens. And I think the Tory party are kind of trapped in this, trying to decide if they want employers to pay 10% extra to employ a migrant or fulfil Suella Braverman's ultimate dream of putting them all on a plane. And I have to say that I find a lot of the discussions that happen a tactic to actually distract from discussing the real economic problems facing the UK, of which I just don't even think this addresses.
Kate, what do you think? Would increasing the supply of unskilled foreign workers right now help Britain's economic problems or not? Is it a cure, or does it
I think it would definitely
compound the problem?
It would definitely help Britain's economic problems. I think Liz Truss turned out to be wrong about a lot of stuff, but she was right in identifying more liberal migration as a way to boost GDP. Where I agree with Richard is there is a rising number of working-age people on out-of-work benefits, and using immigration to gloss over that subject would be the wrong thing to do. Now, a lot of those people are sick. A lot of those people were heavily impacted by the furlough scheme, their mental health issues. We cannot overlook that, and we absolutely need to be working to help adjust those people back into work where they can. But that being said, I mean, I'm a liberal on migration. I think, Richard was talking about the families and the children who want better lives for themselves. I think that for native Brits, I think that for immigrants as well. I'd be very hypocritical if I didn't. I am an immigrant to the UK, the most privileged one you're going to find. And I think about those who are in far less privileged positions than myself and how desperately they want to come and make a better life here. And morally and ethically speaking, I'm very much on board with that. But if we're simply looking at this through an economic lens, we have an almost record high number of vacancies in this country that is actually contributing to inflation, especially in domestic services, because where restaurants can't seat as many people as they used to, they don't have the labor and workforce to do so. They're having to jack up their prices. We need to fill those jobs. It's increasingly clear, at least in the short term. I suspect in the long term, a lot of native Brits aren't going to want to fill those jobs. There is a role for those lower skilled migrants to come to the UK.
Let me ask
James. Should be welcome.
Thanks. Do you agree, James?
Well, I think the big...
And how do we get to the point of it actually happening? Because this seems to be one of those issues which politicians from across the parties are very reluctant to go near, which is why Lord Wolfson's intervention is interesting.
Yeah, but look, I think there's a big part missing from Lord Wolfson's intervention, and actually some of the other comments we've heard here today, which is about the need for growth in the economy. Because over the last 12 years, we've had very low growth. The prospects for the next 2 years put us amongst the lowest in the G7 in terms of growth. What we need is an actual plan for growth. So immigration and skills and so on fits within a much broader, more ambitious plan for growth. We've talked about our investment in insulating homes, in clean energy, in making sure we invest in the new green industries of the future and so on, all of that would drive economic growth. And that's actually essential to growing the economy, increasing wages and making sure we have more sustainable funding for public services.
We had an insight into what your leader thinks about this question about unskilled migration just the other day. This is what Sir Keir Starmer had to say.
We don't want open borders. Freedom of movement has gone and it's not coming back. So that means fair rules, firm rules, a points-based system. What I would like to see is the numbers go down in some areas. I think we're recruiting too many people from overseas into, for example, the health service. But on the other hand, if we need high-skilled people in innovation in tech to set up factories, etc., then I would encourage that. So I don't think there's an overall number here. Some areas we need to go down, other areas we need to go up.
It's Keir Starmer talking about high-skilled immigration. Everybody likes talking about high-skilled immigration, but not what Lord Wolfson's talking about.
Well, I think Keir was talking about us continuing the points-based system, which we said we would do. And he's also making the really important point that the immigration system has to work hand in hand with the skills system. So we need to make sure that whilst we have the skills in the country to do the jobs that need to be done, we're also investing in skills and training here in the UK.
Jo, what do you think?
I think from our perspective, so obviously I'm an education trade union general secretary, we have been really concerned, I think, about the restrictions that have been put on people coming to this country to work, the way in which they are treated, the sort of hostile regime that a lot of migrants are treated to. And, you know, this it extends to people working in the NHS, not just education and beyond. We've seen record levels of xenophobia following Brexit. You know, we are lucky in this country to have migrants still wanting to come here and stay. And I do really worry about the tone of these debates and the dehumanising language.
Do you think Labour's got the right policy on this?
I'm not in favour of what Keir Starmer just said, no. And I think to talk about people who have ambitions, who sometimes have complicated histories, as if they are simply units that we are going to measure and see where we can slot in without thinking of the rich history that this country has. Because all sorts of people, myself included, you know, are from migrant backgrounds and came here. I think it's really unfortunate language, I have to say, from the Labour leader, and I think we should strive for better.
I think Jo makes a lot of really good points there, but the one thing I would push back on is any kind of surprise that migrants still want to come to the UK. It is a fantastic place to come to. It has so much opportunity. There is a reason that people risk their lives to come here and create a better life for themselves. I think we do need more empathy around that, far more empathy around that discussion. I've been disappointed from the Labour Party not to see that thoughtfulness. But in terms of the economy itself,
lack of empathy from the Labour Party on this question.
Well, I think that, you know, I and all of my colleagues in the Labour Party, you know, hugely value the contribution that immigrants to this country have made over many years and are making to this day. We talk about the health service. We know how important workers from overseas are to keeping the health service functioning.
I think the really important point, though, Labour and the Tories on immigration
I think the really important point, though, here is to make sure that the immigration system, the points-based system, works hand in hand with the skills system to make sure that we are training people in the UK as well.
We're moving on. Richard Tice, thank you very much for joining us on the programme. Well, with a budget next week, Labour's obviously trying to show it has some ideas itself for fixing the public finances. And one idea that Sir Keir Starmer is very keen on is ending the tax breaks for private schools.
In the budget next week, he'll be too weak to end his oil and gas giveaway, scrap the non-dom tax breaks, and end the farce of taxpayers subsidising private schools.
James, why do you think this is a good idea?
This is a good idea because politics is about choices. You know, politics is about what you do with public money and what you prioritise. And what Keir has set out is that we would make a decision which is to end the tax break, effectively, for private schools and to use that money to improve state schools.
It's ending charitable status and then charging VAT on fees, I think. That's the policy.
That's right. So it's ending charitable status and removing the VAT exemption that the private schools receive. So that would raise about £1.7 billion overall, and we set out the fully costed, fully funded plan for what that would go toward. It would go towards things like recruiting extra teachers. It would go towards mental health support for pupils in schools. It would go toward helping young people to get jobs. It would go towards all this stuff which is really important in state schools across the country. And yes, we're making a choice that we would remove that tax break for private schools and use that money to support state schools across the country.
Kate, what do you think?
I'm quite sympathetic to the tax break and charitable status for private schools because if you look at their remit, it is to provide education and they're not making profit, and that is exactly what a school is doing. So I think it certainly meets the criteria. Where some private schools, and certainly not all, have gotten themselves probably into a bit of a bind is when you charge extortionate fees. I think it becomes harder and harder to make the case that you really need that tax break. But let's not forget that it is increasingly the case that these private schools are creating bursaries and trying very hard to get people into these schools who otherwise couldn't afford it. I think as long as their remit remains the same, I'm sympathetic to their tax status.
Joe, what do you think this policy is about? Is it about the money that James says can be raised, or is it about the political signal that it sends?
Yeah, so there's a number of issues because, one, if we look at the amount of people, because there is a broader political issue, and I will say something about the finances. 7% of people in the UK go to private school, but if we look at the cabinet, 65% of them went to private school. Every £8,000 that is spent on a pupil in state schools, we see 40,000 for private schools. The tax breaks that you were just talking about that private schools get, your local college, which working class kids go to, they don't get those things. So for me,
it's unfair.
Private schools are engine rooms. Private schools are engine rooms of inequality.
But do you think that the policy is trying to squeeze private schools out of existence?
No, I don't. I think they're just saying that there are tax breaks here. Look, we've just had a debate about nurses using food banks. We've just been talking about the infrastructure of this country crumbling, and yet these institutions that drive inequality in the class system in the UK are subject to a tax break that many others don't get. It's an absurd debate.
To be clear, they don't get tax breaks because they are tax.
Let me ask Tobias.
Well, I mean, really interesting. James talked about choice, and this is a choice where people decide to spend their money or not, or whether they, I think you touched on it, sorry, Kate did, that this is actually, state schools are free. And this charitable status is very, very important to understand, because where academies have now come in, they're able to sort of compete on a very similar vein. We need to understand that there's about, I think, 600,000 children that go into these schools that we're speaking about. If you were to somehow change this in the way that Keir Starmer is talking about, many of them would actually close down. And where would those 600,000 go? They would then go in to the state school, placing greater pressure on the state school as well.
The discussion should be how everyone gets a gold-plated education.
I just make the point in Bournemouth. When I arrived in Bournemouth, everybody, back in 2005, everybody wanted to go to the grammar school because they didn't have faith in the local state schools surrounding the grammar school. So everybody wanted to get their kids into there. Today, I don't get that so much at all, because we've raised the standards in the state schools that they're now sending people to great universities across the country. So we've raised the bar right across the piece. The idea also, final point, sorry to go back to the armed forces, but many of those who go abroad, who are based abroad, need to have somewhere where they can have continuity of education. And if you don't have the ability, to have some of these schools for them to be able to,
Can I quickly ask James about your point?
It does affect them. It disrupts kids when army officers, soldiers are based abroad.
Sorry, Labour saying I think it would save 1.6 billion. You said
1.7.
Raise 1.7, but as Tobias said, wouldn't people then perhaps go to state schools, which would dramatically reduce the scale of that saving?
Well, look, this is about a choice, though, about the tax break, which is currently received by private schools. And actually, the really important point here is about raising the standard across state schools across the country. And that money would go towards, as I said, recruiting extra teachers, helping people to get into work, and making sure that young people's mental health is looked after. All of that is crucial. It is a choice, as we've said. This is a choice that we would get rid of that tax break and spend it on state schools across the country.
Kate?
I think that this issue is very much about signalling more than anything else. And I think you make an important point that the critical point here is to raise the standard of education for everyone. But I think that's always going to involve more choice. And I think anything that tries to crack down on the choice that parents have, and I think ending charitable status would be one of those things, is probably a bad move.
Joe, this is a policy that previous Labour leaders have talked about for years. It's never actually happened. Do you think that Sir Keir Starmer's Labour Party, if they were to enter power, would actually do this?
Quite possibly. For me, the bigger question for Keir and for Labour and for the Conservatives, how are you going to transform education in this country so it is fairer, more accessible, allows adult learners to take part? And this is a small part of that. And I think, the fact is I'm still aware that people don't pay VAT on their private school fees is ridiculous. It seems like the ultimate luxury to me when education's free for everyone else. So, yes, this is an interesting question.
It's funded by the state.
What I want to see is a proper education policy from both Keir and whoever might be the Prime Minister or the leader of the Conservative Party at any point in the future.
You missed the point that you have to pay you still have to pay. So if you don't go to that school and you go to a state school,
I'm fully aware of that. We're talking about
paying.
the thousands.
We will talk about this another time. Tobias, James, Kate and Joe, thank you very much. That is all we have time for today. But I'll be back tomorrow with Politics UK at 12:15 here on BBC Two and on the BBC iPlayer.